Welcome to IMDb. I am Brenton, joined as always by Danielle.
That's me. Hello, everybody.
Thanks for joining us this week as we count up the IMDb's best movies of all time and discuss some of the greatest films you mightn't ever have seen. This week, rated as number 16 on the Internet Movie Database by millions of film lovers from around the world is The Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers. Released in 2002, starring Ian McKellen and Elijah Wood, Andy Serkis and all the others, The Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers is an epic fantasy film that serves as the second of three parts of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. The movie is, I believe, only temporarily at number 16 because of Avengers Endgame, just coming out recently, but this will go down to its rightful place at 15 in the coming weeks. The film is the sequel to the movie that's based on the book that was the sequel to The Hobbit, all written by J.R.R. Tolkien. The film is written, produced, and directed by Peter Jackson. If any of that is too confusing, please go and listen to episode 7 on part 3, The Return of the King, as that's the first one that we reviewed in the list, and we give our impressions on the trilogy as a whole and Tolkien's work, and we make an argument as to why this Lord of the Rings trilogy is the best movie trilogy ever made. And I highly recommend giving that a listen if you haven't already. If you're still not satisfied, please go listen to episode 11 on part 1, The Fellowship of the Ring, because we also do a bit of a non-spoiler section on that as well. So we pretty much cover everything that, Lord of the Rings in general in those two episodes. So I'd be very surprised if anyone listening to this hasn't listened to at least one of those or knows any of the spoilers with it. So we're not going to do a spoiler-free version on Two Towers. If you want those, go see episode 7 and 11.
I still hold my opinion that this trilogy as an entity was the best, work of cinematic filmmaking.
It was such an achievement.
It's 12 hours of cinematic film. But at the same time, remember that it is one entity, and to have that continuity of character development and flow and quality, I stand by my opinion that it is, as a 12-hour entity, it's the best movie ever made.
I really do think that this is such an accomplishment in filmmaking, and we do break that down a little bit more in the Return of the King episode, the first 20 minutes or so. We're looking at that.
How did this movie open? Because I wrote down what a great opening scene, and I remember sitting there watching
The opening scene was Gandalf falling and him chasing the Balrog.
Right. What a great way. You've been hyped up waiting for this movie to come out, and then it comes out and you're like, holy crap, we're right in it. No messing around. You know what I mean?
Well, definitely because you were very sure after the Fellowship of the Ring ended that Gandalf died. That's it. That's the end of it. And this is even played off as a dream sequence almost, but it shows you a bit of a glimpse as to what happened to Gandalf afterwards. It's completely ridiculous. The whole scene is so silly that he catches up with this massive Balrog. He catches his sword, falls for ages and doesn't die. It's all a bit ridiculous, but it is a really cool visual shot to open.
Yeah, as an opening sequence, it's whoa. It's like in Star Wars if you started off with a space battle. You know what I mean? If you started with that.
Yeah. Most movies usually do that.
Yeah,
They just start with a big opening and then it calms down a bit after that. I think this movie, it starts really fast. It just hits note after note. It's bang, 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 bang. And you can get a bit lost and confused because there's these dead soldiers. There's a lot of dead orcs. There's battle scenes. There's a scene with all these villagers fleeing where they're ransacking these villages. There's a few characters in there. You're where is this person? There's a few brutal soldiers, villages that Saruman hires to go burn down the villages, and you're who are these people? Because they're not his normal orcs. And it just briefs over that a bit.
Well, and because Frodo and Sam are separated, and Merry and Pippin are separated from Legolas and Aragorn and Gimli, you've got three groups, so it bounces around between them, and you'll sit there and you'll be I haven't seen Frodo in 40 minutes. What the heck? What's going on? You know what I mean? Yeah.
Well, then it cuts to the King of Rohan in his decrepit state. You haven't seen him before, and all of a sudden you're oh, who is this character? Obviously, he's someone of importance. He's sitting at a throne. There's his riders of Rohan. They killed all the orcs that were the ones that have meant to have taken Merry and Pippin, and they didn't show that battle at all. The last time that we saw Merry and Pippin, where he's about to get stood on by a horse, and the very next scene Aragorn catches up with the riders and they're like, yeah, we just burned all the corpses. We just killed them all through the night. And it's can you show that?
They ran away into the trees.
They eventually showed a flashback, but I'm just saying, like, it cuts and it's very fast. It doesn't show the riders killing it.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, like, the first half an hour of this movie is just cut, 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 cut. It's a bunch of introducing a new people and new groups and new settings, and it can be a little confusing, especially if it's been a while since you've seen Fellowship of the Ring.
Like, it's all necessary, and which is why this is a bridging movie. Because most of the time, the second in a trilogy can't stand alone. And this one, like, it does an okay job of standing alone, but if you haven't seen the first one, you won't understand a lot of what's going on.
I can see what you mean by the second one can't really stand alone, but there are exceptions, like we did Empire Strikes Back the other week, the Dark Knight trilogy. The second one's definitely the best. But I do think that they're exceptions, they're rarities, I guess.
Yes, generally speaking. And like I said, this one does do a pretty good job, but you're just missing key details that enhance your movie watching experience if you don't see the first one. So,
well, especially when we spoke about this, it's more of a part than a sequel. It's a part 2. So it'd be silly. It's like watching the second half of a movie instead of watching the first.
I would like to talk about Gollum, if we could, and I don't think this is...
This is the first time you actually see that character, which is interesting because they went out of their way to try to not show it off in the first movie. You see sort of just a silhouette or a creature in the distance. There's one scene where you see his eyes glowing in the dark, and they don't show Gollum. And then as soon as this movie sort of starts, it's like, bam, here he is. And then he's there for the rest of the series.
I wanted to make a note. So this is the second time I've watched this, and it took me until probably the middle of this movie to realize who his two sides were. I didn't realize that Gollum and Smeagol were really two separate personalities.
Yeah, that's what I would count their personalities as. Smeagol as the original Hobbit.
I thought Smeagol became Gollum, and then they were, like, just calling him Smeagol because that's who he used to be. I didn't realize that Smeagol was very much still a part of him, just as Gollum had become a part of him.
I feel like he didn't realize that Smeagol was still a part of him, and it comes out and gets more strong towards the end of these series. So I don't think he was Smeagol for a very long time. I think he even believed that Smeagol turned into Gollum rather than as an addition. Does that make any sense?
It does, but at the same time it doesn't, because he always refers to himself as we, so he knows that both are there.
Yeah, okay.
And I never understood until halfway through this movie. I'm like, oh! Because I'm like, why is he calling us we? Is he just crazy? I didn't realize that he was two personalities coexisting. He is. He's like two alters of the same person, coexisting together. And those scenes, like, it's in the next one when he has this monologue, isn't it? No, he had one in this one. Sorry.
He had one in this where it cuts the shot back and forth. It really looks like two characters are talking with each other.
And I never understood what that was about until I understood that he's literally fighting with himself. I mean, I knew that, but I thought he was, like, possessed. I didn't know if it was, like, the Ring or Sauron talking through him, which basically I guess it is.
Well, the Ring corrupted him, but I wouldn't say it's Sauron talking through him.
No, it's his corrupted version of himself. I didn't pick up on that and clue into that until this watching of the movie, so I kind of just wanted to talk about that because I thought it was really interesting and it really added to those scenes for me.
Just on those scenes, like, Andy Serkis is such a good actor in this character, isn't he?
Good.
Like, we had a bit of a segment in Return of the King, I believe it was, where we talked about Andy Serkis and his performance for this, but I just think he's brilliant. And
they didn't, like, do anything to his voice, did they?
They might have, but he can do it pretty well. Even today, after years of doing the character, he can put on the Gollum voice pretty well. I think out of all three of them, I like this one the least. I think Two Towers is probably my least favorite, with Return of the King being the most.
Mm-hmm. I really don't consider these three movies as three movies. I really don't.
Yeah, but I'd like to think, which part do I enjoy the most?
Yeah, because I think of them as just flowings on of the same entity. There's parts that I like of all of them and parts that I don't like of all of them.
Another example of a sequel or the middle part of a trilogy that's really good or arguably better than the first is the Godfather movies. The only two sequels that have ever got won Best Picture at the Oscars is Godfather Part 2 and Return of the King. The thing about Two Towers is that I think it is a little bit more ridiculous. Like, there are definitely things in the first and the third parts, but this one asks you to swallow a fair bit, like particularly that scene at the beginning with Gandalf falling. There was Aragorn tracking the hobbits. That whole process is probably outlined better in the book, but it's a bit crazy, especially after that fire where they'd burnt all of them, and he's just like, oh, I can see exactly what happened here. There was a struggle. And it's like, yeah, bullshit. They trampled all of these things in battle, and then they rounded up all the bodies and burnt them. There's a lot of stuff that happens at Helm's Deep. The way that Legolas gets on that horse in that scene where...
Yeah,
it's like, what are you doing?
Just physically speaking, like, we know there's a lot that goes on in this that can't happen in real life, but physics still applies in a lot of these situations. And this movie in particular, it's like, that's not how a lever works. You know what I mean? Like, that's not how
with the
that
ladders.
would happen.
I hadn't even noticed that. The way that they're putting the ladders up, that's literally impossible.
Now that I think about it, there's a lot, actually. There's a lot.
I just feel like it asks you to swallow a lot more of that than the other two parts.
Yeah.
Well, even Gandalf showing up in the forest as the White Wizard now. The last time we saw him, if the dream sequence was real, was him crashing into the center of the earth with the Balrog. And then he shows up in the forest. Like, even if... How the hell did you get there? Why were you there? It just happens to be there at the exact same time. Like, none of that's explained.
I think he wizarded himself there.
He wizarded. That's cheap.
Yeah.
Another thing about him wizarding is how does he get around so quick? Because even in the first one of the opening scenes is he's trying to figure out whether or not the ring that Bilbo has is the ring. So he goes over to Minas Tirith and he goes into the library and does a lot of research, and then he goes back to Hobbiton.
Just pops over.
Yeah, like just for the weekend. It's like, you've established how far away these things are and how grand that trip is. How are you able to do that? Don't just say, oh, you wizarded, oh, you used the eagles. That's because that's like, come on.
Yeah. He
I
could
feel
have.
like that was added in for the movie because I think in the book, Gandalf knows. I haven't read the book, I don't know. I just feel like it's slightly more ridiculous than the other ones. I think I enjoy it the least. It's probably because there's so many things happening in different places all over Middle-earth because the characters are split up, but I feel like the story is the most all over the place. Not just physically in locations, but it's hard to see these characters and how they're interacting. It's more cut all over the place, and it's harder to follow than the other ones.
And I think, too, part of that is the nature of the beast in that this is a movie. In a book, you can get away with that a little bit more. And to ring true to the story, you have to follow it somewhat to a T. So, I mean, I give them a little bit of leeway there because, I mean, all of this was necessary. You know, all of the setting things up for Return of the King that had to be done in this movie, it was necessary. And I do want to say, too, this was vastly entertaining. Like, the fact that it's probably our least favorite of the three, I still really enjoy this. You know?
Oh, I do too. That's why I said I really like Helm's Deep.
If the other two are like a 9.1 and a 9, this is an 8.9. You know what I mean?
Well, it's interesting that even in this discussion, I've been thinking about which ones I enjoy the most, but it's very much reflected in the IMDb listings, right? You've got Return of the King at number 7, Fellowship at 11, Two Towers at 15 or 16, which week you look at it. But it's very much in that order, and they're not too far behind. There's only 4 titles in between Fellowship of the Ring and Two Towers. So that's very much how I feel about it. It's like, yes, it's slightly better, but not by much.
Well, and I think that really speaks volumes about
the series.
The series and the quality, because the only 2 series that are so close together like that are The Godfather and The Lord of the Rings. You know,
and we spoke about that in the discussion about the trilogies in The Return of the King. There's not many other trilogies that are up there. We spoke about Star Wars as well, because all 3 of those are in the top 100. But apart from that, those are the only ones. It's a very good series.
It's a very good series.
Even with its flaws.
There's so much going on in this movie that I don't really know what to talk about specifically because it really is all over the place.
Again,
because it's a bridger, you're like, did that happen in this one or the first one or the last one? So I kind of just want to talk about some themes. So the Steward of Gondor asks Boromir to go to that meeting that Elrond called in Rivendell because he wanted him to bring the ring back as a weapon for Gondor to become great again, right? He said, you need to bring this...
So the steward wanted the ring.
He wanted the ring to bring glory to Gondor. And he says specifically to Boromir, he's like, you are not just any man, you're stronger and it won't corrupt you. And I just remember sitting there thinking, I'm like, there is no one who this ring won't corrupt. It even corrupted Frodo. Like, Frodo wouldn't have destroyed the ring if Sam hadn't been there. And even then, the only reason it did get destroyed is because Gollum tried to steal it from him and they were fighting over it and fell into the volcano.
Well, it's interesting that Sam didn't get corrupted at all. I wonder why that is. Like, I know
because he didn't touch it.
Yes. Well, even Gandalf was frightened to touch it because he didn't know his own temptations. He didn't want to touch it at all.
So I'm just thinking, like, how ignorant can you be about the power of this thing? It just really showed the greed of men and the ignorance of men because they think that they can handle it. And it's like, you realize that nobody can handle this.
Yeah.
I don't remember who said it, but they said the ring will give whoever has it the power to destroy the world of men. Because Sauron wanted it, and he was doing it for Sauron, and it made even more sense, that statement, having the knowledge now that the wizards aren't just powerful men. Because upon first watch, I didn't realize that the wizards were angelic. They aren't men. So that made a little bit more sense. And this series almost needs 2 watches, or to read the books first, to fully appreciate it, because you need to watch it and figure out who all the characters are, and then you need to go learn about the lore.
There's a lot of background lore.
Yeah, and I mean, if you're into that, which I certainly am because I'm a fantasy fanatic, but I was just saying, like, this viewing made a lot more sense to me of the whole trilogy.
Because this is the second time you've seen this one through, and you've done a little bit more research in between watchings. We said in the Fellowship of the Ring episode, you asked me why does Aragorn live for so long? Because he's like 87 or something. Mm-hmm. And I said, I'm pretty sure they explained it in the second one, so we'll just wait and watch that. And now after watching it, they do bring it up and say that he is old. Is it Erwin?
Erwin, yeah.
She's like, oh, she says, you're one of the Dunedain.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not explained anymore. She's just like, oh, you're one of these people that live really long. And that's it. Because obviously you can't fit in all the background and lore of this world. It's just like so in depth. Mm-hmm. So I looked it up as to what does that even mean. Mm-hmm. And there's like a whole family tree. There's races through the ages. And he wrote so much history in all of this. It's like ridiculous.
So what's the deal?
Yeah, because she says that you're one of the Dunedain blessed with long life. So I looked it up, and the average man would be from 150 to 200 years old. And some of the older people, or the kings, can be from 240 to 270 years old.
Okay.
So I looked up, what does that actually mean? And it says, oh, well, the Dunedain are descendants of the Numenorians?
Okay.
I believe is pronounced. And the average person lasted from 300 to 350 years, while the kings and the elders there would go from 400 to 500 years old. Which seems, it's again, like, I'm like, okay, so what does that mean?
Are they
who are they descendants of?
Are they part Elvish or something?
Maybe. I feel like far enough back that they were sort of Elvish and immortal. And it seems like each generation, their lives are getting shorter. And then come to the present day, you've got people whose average lifespan is like 85 or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. It sounds like in Tolkien's lore, the more centuries that go by, the shorter life of man are. Okay, I don't know why that is or what he was trying to say there, but that's what it seems like. Because Aragorn is one of the last living people of the previous era.
Okay.
And before that, they lived even longer, and before that, they lived even longer, and now average humans don't live very long at all. So he's special. I don't really understand that, and that's not explained I'm sure a lot of people listening to this understand it more than me.
I
if
remember
you know the lore.
when hearing that he was so much older and that he would live for a lot longer, I'm just like, man, Arwen really picked a good one, didn't she? Because
Yeah, pick the one guy that can live longer than everyone else. And he's a king.
yeah. I mean, sure, she's already fallen in love with him and would probably love him anyway, but like 70 years is like a blink in the life of an elf.
Yeah, and then she gave up her immortality for him.
But the point is, like, they're gonna live a long time.
Yeah. It's a lot of those things where they're just like, we probably just don't have the time to explain this. But it's not clear as to why exactly he lives longer. They're just like, yeah, he lives longer.
It is easier to swallow, though, knowing that you're like, stuff's all different in this fantasy world. So it's one of those things that you can kind of take and just go with it.
I was just going to note, how short do you reckon these series would be if they were just shot in real time? Like, the amount of scenes that are just purely in slow motion is a bit ridiculous. There's a whole scene where Gandalf whistles for his horse, and it runs from the other side of the field all the way up until it's touching Gandalf's hand completely in slow motion. It's just like, okay, you can take your finger off the slow-mo button now. Like, even the Ents, when they destroy the dam, that whole dam sequence is in slow motion. Like, the water's just falling and flowing in such a magical way.
And then at the same time, though, the water was falling slowly, but the Ents were moving in real time, which is slow, but they were still moving faster than the water. I'm like, there's no way he'd get out of the way in time.
It's because they're CG. They could just make it look like...
whatever.
Yeah, they can do whatever they want.
I would like to talk about whether or not Harry Potter rips off Lord of the Rings. Because I think we started to talk about that, but we really we're saving that conversation for this episode so that we could have a comprehensive view, watch through all 3 movies, pick out every little detail that could have similarity, of which there are many, I might add, and then talk about it.
Because you're quite the fan of Harry Potter, and now you've seen this. Yeah, you've seen through this series twice now. And the first time you're watching it, you said to yourself, Harry Potter really ripped off quite a lot from this series. And in the episode on Return of the King, we did do a comparison between Dumbledore and Gandalf, which is probably the easiest one to make. Mm-hmm. And people have reached out to J.K. Rowling and said, yeah, a lot of these are the same sort of things you're hitting here, the same characters and the same themes. And she said, yeah, it's all superficial.
That's what I was going to add, is that on a surface level, the similarities are quite extreme. You're like, that's the same thing. But when you look into everything and all these elements a bit deeper, you realize they actually are quite different. But on a surface level, they look extremely similar.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. We made a bit of a list going through it as to what actually they are. And I will give it to her, we are just being picky, and they are absolutely surface level, superficial stuff. But I think that there's 2 or 3 traits in there where they're so similar that it's like, yeah, alright, come on now. This is ripped off.
I don't think it would be unfair to say that she was absolutely
heavily
inspired.
Influenced.
And yeah, heavily influenced by Tolkien. Absolutely. Like, there's no way you can say that just by, there are far too many things that we listed for it to just be coincidence.
See, George R.R. Martin wrote a Game of Thrones series. Well, he started those in the mid-90s, before Harry Potter was released, and obviously after Tolkien. And again, that's a very big mythical fantasy series that he wrote. And some things are taken from it, but he generally did something really quite original with the Game of Thrones series, and it didn't have so many overlapping traits. And obviously Harry Potter does as well. Harry Potter's building its own world. But I think she definitely was more inspired by a lot of these
took
things.
A lot of things and just put her own spin on it. I'd like to actually get into that list now.
Or modernized it.
Yeah. Should I just go through as we wrote it, like in the order that we wrote it? Okay.
Read out what you got.
Okay. So, first of all is Gandalf and Dumbledore, which we talked about before.
Yep.
And they look very similar.
That's just your classic wizard look, though. That's why. Like any depiction of Merlin the wizard, you know?
Even Saruman looks very similar to Gandalf.
Yeah.
So, yeah, fair enough. You've got a pair of mischievous characters who are Merry and Pippin and Fred and George, who one set actually are twins and the other could very well be twins, which I think is interesting.
I think they're cousins.
Okay.
Yeah, they're just the comic relief, really.
And I think it's very interesting how in the beginning of The Lord of the Rings, they set off fireworks dragon, a magical fireworks dragon. That happens exactly in, what is it, book
5.
6?
Order of the
5,
Phoenix.
okay.
Because they do it for Umbridge.
Yeah, to make their exit. So your same characters, your mischievous characters, set off a magic firework dragon. You know what I mean? Like,
well, even there's a comparison between Samwise and Ron. Or even Elijah Wood and Daniel Radcliffe. They always get
look
mistaken.
very similar. They do.
Yeah.
So next is that the main characters, so Harry and Frodo, both live with their uncle because their parents died. Surface level, not the end of the world. There's an importance on historical swords. So the sword of Isildur
Right.
and the sword of Gryffindor. There are a lot more historical artifacts in Harry Potter that have significance, but that's just one. Again, that's more of a loose link, but it's there. One very, very strong, and probably the most evident to anybody watching this, is the similarities between the Nazgul and the Dementors.
Yeah.
They're pretty much, I mean, what they do is different, but they're pretty much exactly the same. You know what I mean? Dementors eat your soul to the point where you're just a shell of a person. And if you're attacked by a ring wraith, a Nazgul, you become a wraith yourself, a shell of a person. You're caught between life and death. And they look incredibly similar.
See, that's one of the ones where I think that's a little bit more than superficial. Like, that's pretty much a copied character. And I understand that they're obviously based off depictions of the Grim Reaper and death. And J.K. Rowling has said that she was inspired by her depression periods. And these characters are meant to make you feel depressed. Like, you feel bad for ever feeling good again, or you don't believe that you'll ever feel happiness again. But that's very much what the Nazgul are doing as well. They bring that cold feeling to you. It's very much the same character.
Yeah, so that's one that I'd say that's probably the biggest one for me. Another is that you've got your bad guy having a sidekick. So in Harry Potter, for Voldemort, it's Wormtail, and for Saruman, it's Wormtongue, and they look very similar.
That's another one that's more than being super. That's more of a deep one, because not only is the name similar and it's this slimy character that's the sidekick, he was originally the good guy and then he was betrayed and went to the bad side.
Exactly.
That's the deep part to it, where it's like, okay, you've got like 3 or 4 traits of this character that are the same.
Yeah, so it is, and he's greasy and he's cowers a bit.
Yeah.
I think Wormtongue is a bit more ballsy than Wormtail ever was. And the difference there, too, is that Wormtail to Voldemort would be more as Wormtongue to Sauron instead of Saruman. But, I mean, it's not so far-fetched. Another is the Pensieve and the Mirror of Galadriel, which also is very similar to the Mirror of Erised in Harry Potter. So,
yeah,
that's kind of 2 things drawn from one. So, the Mirror of Galadriel is a bowl of water that you look into and you see what your future could hold. And that's kind of similar, like the Pensieve is a bowl of mist in which you look at your memories, and the Mirror of Erised is the mirror in which you look into it and see your heart's deepest desire.
So it is definitely a twist on the elements there, but I can see an overlap of these mystical elements.
I can see how they definitely would have been inspired by Tolkien's Mirror of Galadriel.
See, I appreciate that. If that is inspired by the Mirror of Galadriel, it's a good take on it. Like, she's done her own thing with it. Yeah. And I don't mind that as a series of copying, I guess. Quote unquote.
Well, yeah, because it's not. It's like,
it's not. You're doing
I like
your own
this
thing
and
with it.
I want to take this element, I want to do something else to it.
There's obviously a lot of overlap with mythical creatures as well, which are obviously going to be evident in series like this. Like, you've got the cave trolls, which is a big bumbling brutes of characters that are just sort of like used in battle. And then you've got the giant spiders. The
interesting thing here is that they made them look very similar.
Yeah.
Which Warner Brothers didn't necessarily have to do. You know what I mean? But those characters do look very similar. Or those creatures, sorry. Yeah, you've got giant spiders.
The 2 creatures that are probably the most different are the elves and the house elves in Harry Potter. They're like not even the same.
Yeah.
Tolkien did something different with elf lore when he made those, because elves, like even just thinking about the elves in Santa's Workshop, and how they're depicted, they're more like Dobby the House Elf.
Mm-hmm.
And Tolkien did something that I've never seen, I haven't personally seen elves depicted as these tall, human-like, immortal, elegant, classical characters before. So he really did something original there.
I think he did. I can't remember, because I am quite into mystical lore.
You would know more than me.
And I would have always thought of elves as similar to goblins and fairies, with elves and goblins being just a little bit different, kind of like cousins of the same genus or something. I really like what he did with elvish lore.
What else you got on your list?
Something, again, similar is there are forbidden forests. So I don't remember what the forest was called, but the forest surrounding Isengard.
Right, yes.
Giant moving trees.
Was it Mirkwood?
It might have been Mirkwood. I don't remember. But yeah, so just forests that you have to be wary of. You've got Ares' invisibility cloak and the One Ring with the ability to give you invisibility in the real world.
Yep.
You've got that aesthetic between, what was that other woodland elf's name?
Oh, I forget.
Anyways, him or Legolas and Lucius Malfoy.
Yeah, I always think
incredibly similar.
Him, the same actor, looks very similar. One of the elements that I think, again, is not superficial, like two actors looking the same, is the fact that, particularly in the Deathly Hallows, when they've got the Horcrux around their neck, it has very similar traits to the One Ring around Frodo's neck.
Yes, and there was a ring.
Yeah, there was.
The ring that killed Dumbledore's hand. I think the thing they had around their neck, though, was actually the locket. Was it the locket?
Yes. But it brings out the dark side of you and makes you act like you're not yourself, and it's like there's such a burden that they have to keep passing between the characters as to not put it on one person or the other. And it has like really dark magic in it. That's very similar.
That's heavily influenced.
Because they have to like go on this journey to destroy this thing that's tormenting them, and that's exactly what happens in both of those series.
To touch more on that dark magic and the antagonists in both of these series, one you can look at for sure is how, not necessarily the spirit, but the essence of both Sauron and Voldemort endured and continued to exist, because they put part of themselves into an object.
Yeah, in the Fellowship of the Ring, they definitely describe that, like, the Dark Lord is rising again, and he's been dormant for so long, but he's building an army, and I'm like, did they take this literally from one movie and put it in the other? Because there's a couple of lines there from the Wizards where you could close your eyes and think that you're in the other series.
Yeah.
The way that it's worded about this Dark Lord rising again, and I'm like, well, that's very much a very deep element that's copied over.
You've got the juxtaposition of Gandalf to Sauron as Dumbledore was to Grindelwald, in that they were very, very close at one time and they turned on each other.
I didn't even think of that one. That's a good one.
Mm-hmm. Saruman's switch to the dark side is similar to the Death Eaters coming out of hiding. That one for me isn't quite as strong, because the Death Eaters had already claimed allegiance to Voldemort.
And I mentioned in the Fellowship of the Ring episode, I'm not really sure what makes him change after all these years, that make that switch.
Yeah.
What was the turn of events that made the Lord of the Rings happen, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. That's really the whole list, and I think you can agree with us when I say that's a lot of things that are quite similar.
There's, we'll admit that a lot of them were just being nitpicky, but I still stick by the 3 or 4 of them there. It's like, alright, that's pretty similar.
And that's quite a few, you know what I mean? Like, 3 or 4 is quite a few.
I still really like them as a whole, and as a whole, they're very different series.
Oh, I had one
more. But it
more.
was just interesting, a bit of overlap there.
I forgot, a big one. The Council of Elrond and the Fellowship of the Ring are very similar to the Order of the Phoenix and Dumbledore's army.
Yeah, where they create a group to try and go fight this evil force or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a good one.
Anyways, that's it. That's what I have to say about those similarities, and I've been, kind of bursting at the seams to share that list, and I'd be curious to hear what other people have to say about it, Because I love having conversations about lore. I think fantasy fans in particular can get very, very passionate, just as sci-fi fans can.
Oh, yeah.
Well, you and I used to have lengthy conversations about Harry Potter when you were reading the books.
Because there's so many plot holes. Like, I know there's a lot of fanboys out there that think that it's, like, completely perfect. And I have read through the whole series. I was making a list to you, being like, well, this doesn't add up, and that doesn't add up. And it makes me feel better when J.K. Rowling gets on the Her Pottermore website or on Twitter or something, and also agrees that there's a lot of plot holes in it. Particularly in the Goblet of Fire, there's a lot. If I read through those series again, I'll do a whole bloody podcast on all the plot holes in it. But she said, yeah, it's full of plot holes, but just enjoy it. Like, I couldn't write the story that I wanted to do unless it had these plot holes in it. So if you just turn a blind eye to it, you can still really enjoy it. And I can get behind that.
Which is what I did. Like, I've never been one much to ruffle feathers of...
Well, it didn't stop me from enjoying it.
Of an established... Yeah, like, of an established plot line, unless it's, like, really blaringly evident. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Is there anything else you'd like to say?
That's really all my points. I think we touched on everything that we wanted to. Just, we didn't talk much about this movie because there's so much going on that it's hard to, you know?
Well, and because we covered so much on Lord of the Rings in the other 2 episodes, so you pretty much can get your Lord of the Rings fix between the 3 of these episodes, which is why I'm okay going on such a big tangent in this one, comparing Harry Potter and such.
Otherwise, we're just repeating ourselves.
Yeah, we'll just be retreading it, and it just gets boring. No one wants to listen to it. So that's our discussion on Lord of the Rings.
Cool. Thanks for joining us.
We have been Danielle and Brenton this week. Thanks for joining us. Feel free to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Check us out on all the socials and comment on SoundCloud. And until next week, thanks for listening.